If you've ever been intrigued by the strange and powerful gods of ancient Egypt, gods with falcon heads, lion bodies, or sun discs balanced on their skulls, or if you've ever wondered how myth shaped daily life and kingship and the afterlife in one of the world's oldest civilizations, or if you're a fan of the Kane Chronicles and want to go beyond the magic to see the real myths behind Rick Riordan's storytelling, if so, then today's book just might be for you. Today, I'll be reviewing Egyptian Myth, a very short introduction by Geraldine Pinch. Welcome to Spencer Reads Everything. I'm your host, Spencer Duncan, and I'm currently working through a number of these very short introduction volumes because they've become an essential part of the research I do for my other channel, History Unraveled with Dr. Duncan, where I produce long-form history content and short, punchy videos that ask tough questions about the past. If that sounds interesting to you, please check out my other channel. Again, History Unraveled with Dr. Duncan. And if this review resonates with you, be sure to explore my very short introduction playlist for more videos like this one. These aren't just reviews, they are part of my process, and hopefully they'll be useful to you whether you're brushing up on ancient civilizations, diving into mythological frameworks, or just expanding your historical horizons. Today's book dives into the world of Egyptian mythology, not just the famous gods, but the cultural and religious structures that made those myths so central to Egyptian identity. But first, let me talk a little bit about the author. She is an incredibly interesting individual. Geraldine Pinch, also known in her fiction writing as Geraldine Harris, is a British Egyptologist and author born in 1951. She has spent much of her academic career affiliated with the University of Oxford, specifically in the Faculty of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies. Her scholarship focuses on ancient Egyptian religion and mythology, particularly in the New Kingdom period, and she has written widely for both academic and popular audiences. In addition to her Egyptological work, Pinch is also known for her fantasy fiction, especially the Seven Citadels series published in the early 1980s. I have not read it, but I am certainly intrigued. And her ability to bridge the gap between rigorous academic work and accessible storytelling makes her especially suited to writing a volume like Egyptian Myth, a very short introduction. Among her scholarly works are New Kingdom Votive Offerings to Hathor and Egyptian Mythology, a guide to the gods, goddesses, and traditions of ancient Egypt, which remains a go-to reference in the field. This book does so much more than just cover the most famous gods and goddesses of ancient Egypt. There is a lot to dig into. So let's take a look at a chapter by chapter summary. In the first chapter, The Myth of Egypt, Imagined Egypts, this chapter explores how Egypt itself is a myth. It's constructed and reconstructed through time. The author dives into how modern interpretations of Egyptian myth are shaped by classical authors, as well as biblical associations and Orientalist perspectives. Egypt became a symbol of exoticism, mysticism, and tyranny, often projected by outsiders who misunderstood its culture. And so the author unpacks how these imagined Egypts, ranging from romantic fascination to moral cautionary tales, have influenced everything from Freemasonry to film. But she also calls for a recentering of Egyptian voices by returning to indigenous texts and images, not just outsider interpretations. In chapter 2, Divine Words, Language, and Myth, the author links language to divine power, focusing on how writing, especially hieroglyphs, was seen as a sacred act in Egypt. Hieroglyphs were believed to have magical potency. Writing someone's name could preserve their identity for eternity or alternatively erase them from existence if destroyed. Myths about the god Thoth, who invented writing, reinforce this connection between language and cosmic order. This chapter highlights the performative aspect of Egyptian writing. To write was to make something real, and the author also reflects on how priests and magicians used script in spells and hymns and rituals to invoke divine presence. In chapter 3, the gods themselves, deities, and myth. In this one, Egyptian gods are presented as complex, multifaceted beings with both localized and cosmic aspects. The author describes them not as characters in fixed stories, but as forces that acted in particular contexts. One god might be depicted as nurturing in one myth and vengeful in another. Deities like Isis, Osiris, Horus, and Set are introduced not only through their narratives, but also their symbols and the temples and their associated rituals. The chapter challenges readers to let go of Greco-Roman assumptions about mythology and to embrace the symbolic, often contradictory nature of Egyptian divine imagery. Chapter 4, The Beautiful Moment, Creation Myths. And if this one is an interesting one to you, please go check out my video where I review the great courses on creation myths. This chapter presents multiple overlapping creation stories from different Egyptian cult centers, especially Heliopolis, Memphis, and Hermopolis. The author explores how each myth centers on a primordial moment of emergence from chaos, often involving a primeval mound, the waters of Nun, and gods like Atum or Ptah. Rather than contradicting each other, these stories reflect theological diversity and political competition between cities. The author emphasizes that creation was not a one-time event, but a continuous process. Rituals and offerings were daily attempts to sustain the ordered world, which was known as Maat, against chaos, which was known as Isfet. In chapter 5, Black Land, Red Land, the landscapes of myth, this chapter links myth to Egypt's geography, the Black Land, or the fertile Nile Valley, and Red Land, or the desert chaos, were both physical realities and mythical concepts. Gods and spirits were thought to dwell in specific locations like temples and tombs and even sacred lakes, and myth often served to map and mythologize this landscape. The desert was associated with chaos and danger, symbolized by Set, while the Nile flood represented renewal. Pinch highlights how myth made the physical world legible, explaining natural phenomena like eclipses or droughts through divine narratives. In chapter 6, Lord of the Two Lands, Myths of Nationhood. Egyptian myths were deeply tied to kingship. Pharaohs were seen as Horus in life and Osiris in death, embodying divine order. This chapter shows how myths legitimized royal power and justified political unification. Stories about divine succession, like the contest between Horus and Set, mirrored human struggles for authority. Temple inscriptions often mythologized a king's deeds, blending history with cosmic purpose. The author also explains how mythic motifs helped centralize power and reinforced the image of the pharaoh as the essential link between gods and people. In chapter 7, the big fight, conflict, and reconciliation, this chapter focuses on cosmic battles between Horus and Set, Ra and Apep, the chaos serpent, and others. These myths embody recurring themes of rivalry, disruption, and eventual harmony. The author is careful to show that reconciliation, not total victory, is often the resolution. The defeat of chaos is temporary and must be reenacted through ritual. These stories weren't just entertainment, they were templates for dealing with social and political conflict. Pharaohs often portrayed themselves as warriors, enacting these myths and reinforcing their role as divine champions of order. Chapter 8, The Eyes of Heaven, Pairs and Sequences. In this one, Egyptian myth relies on balance and duality, sun and moon, order and chaos, upper and lower Egypt. The author explains how many myths hinge on the pairing of gods, especially male and female deities like Isis and Osiris or Geb and Nut. These pairs often represent creative tension or harmonious balance. Time was also viewed cyclically. Patterns shaped how Egyptians imagined divine action through daily, yearly, and eternal perceptions of time. Myth helped align human time with cosmic rhythms. Sunrise was the triumph of Ra, and every death mimicked the death of Osiris. Chapter 9, Personal Myths, Myth and Popular Religion. In this one, the author brings myth down to the individual level. She describes how everyday Egyptians interacted with myths through amulets, household shrines, prayers, and funerary texts like the Book of the Dead. Myth was not limited to the elite, it permeated daily life. Women might invoke Isis for protection during childbirth, or workers might call on Ptah before building a structure. Popular religion used myth to make sense of suffering and illness and hope. Even the afterlife was imagined through mythic geography, the field of reeds, the judgment scenes, and a sacred journey. Chapter 10, The Blessing of the Mummy, the Mythology of Death. This is the final chapter, and it weaves together death rituals and myth. Mummification was not just preservation, but transformation, allowing the deceased to become Osiris. Myth guided the soul's journey through the afterlife, past guardians and judges, toward eternal life. The author highlights the dynamic relationship between text, ritual, and tomb art in enacting these beliefs. Death myths weren't only about the individual. They reinforced cosmic order. Every burial reaffirmed the cycles of life and death and renewal, linking the mortal with the eternal through mythic precedent. There are quite a few really important argumentative distinctions that she weaves throughout this book. For example, she argues that Egyptian myth was not a unified canon. She emphasizes that Egyptian mythology was never standardized into a single unified narrative like the Greek or Norse mythic systems. Instead, it consisted of regional, temple-specific, and often contradictory traditions that coexisted. This plurality challenges modern assumptions about what a mythology should look like and reminds us that the Egyptians did not require internal consistency in the same way modern readers often expect. She also argues that myth was not just religious, it was political and practical. Egyptian myths were deeply embedded in the political ideology of kingship and the rituals of state. She argues that myth was a tool used to legitimize the pharaoh's rule and affirm Ma'at, or that cosmic order which I already referenced, and to reinforce social hierarchy. At the same time, myths were present in popular religion and magic and household rituals, blurring the line between state narrative and personal belief. She also argues that the landscape was mythologized. One of Pinch's unique contributions is her argument that the Egyptian landscape itself was shaped by myth. The Nile, the desert, and even specific cities were mapped onto the divine stories, making Egypt not just the setting of myths, but a mythological entity itself. The division between the Black Land and the Red Land, or the fertile Nile Valley, versus the dangerous desert. All of it reflected and reinforced the mythic dichotomies of order versus chaos. She also argues that myth was always being rewritten. She carefully shows that Egyptian myth was dynamic, with new versions of stories appearing across time, often tailored to local temples, specific deities, or new political regimes. This challenges the stereotype of Egypt as culturally static and shows instead a tradition that was flexible, adaptable, and creative over millennia. She also argues that death was not the end, but a mythic transition. Rather than seeing death as a final boundary, Egyptian myth framed it as a transformation. The author details how mortuary rituals, tomb art, and even the process of mummification were all shaped by mythic narratives, especially the story of Osiris, who becomes a model for resurrection. This mythic framing gave Egyptians a hopeful but demanding vision of the afterlife, rooted in cosmic cycles and divine judgment. I found this an incredibly fascinating work, but I also found a lot of fun facts. For example, Isis was the most popular Egyptian goddess, even in Rome. Isis, originally a local goddess in the Nile Delta, rose to become one of the most venerated deities in the Roman Empire. Her worship extended well beyond Egypt, with temples as far afield as Britain, and she was seen as a model of magic, motherhood, and wifely devotion. Set was not always the villain. Although Set later became associated with chaos and was demonized, especially when Egypt was ruled by foreigners, early myths present him as a necessary force who helped protect the sun god Ra during his nightly journey through the underworld. His complex role challenges the good versus evil binary we often expect in myth. The afterlife had its own book club. The Book of the Dead is actually a modern name for a collection of magical spells that Egyptians believed would help guide them through the dangers of the underworld. These texts were often customized, with spells chosen and arranged based on the individual status and their beliefs, as well as regional traditions. Cows were sacred to the sky. Hathor, or the cow goddess, was associated with the sky, as well as with joy and music and motherhood. In one version of the creation myth, the sky itself was imagined as a giant cow whose body arched over the earth, with stars forming along her belly. Egyptian gods had fusion forms. Egyptian deities often combined with one another to create syncretic forms. For instance, Amun and Ra became Amun-Ra, a composite deity who merged Amun's local power with Ra's solar authority. These mergers allowed myths to evolve and adapt across dynasties and cult centers. There's a mythical reason for the Eye of Horus symbol. The ubiquitous Eye of Horus symbol comes from a myth in which Horus loses his eye in a battle with Set. The eye is magically restored and becomes a symbol of healing, protection, and of completeness. Egyptians used it in jewelry, amulets, and even accounting, and this is a symbol that we actually still see very much to this day when people invoke ancient Egypt. Mummies were modeled on Osiris. The way Egyptians wrapped the decorated mummies was not just practical, it was an attempt to make the deceased resemble Osiris, the god of the dead and rebirth. Tomb rituals reenacted Osiris myths to ensure the deceased's safe passage to eternal life. I must say that I found Egyptian Myth, a very short introduction, to be a fascinating and a rewarding read. We often grow up learning Greek and Roman mythology as the default canon of ancient stories, and Egyptian mythology tends to get mentioned only in passing, maybe as a backdrop for pyramids or mummies, or as exotic set dressing in pop culture. But this book reminded me that Egyptian myth has its own incredibly rich, dynamic, and deeply rooted traditions that intersect with, but are also quite distinct from, the more familiar Greco-Roman tales. It was particularly fun to trace how these myths evolved across time, interacted with political power, and were used by everyday Egyptians in their own religious practices. The emphasis on imagery and symbolism, such as the prominence of eyes and animals in landscape, felt especially powerful when compared to the more anthropocentric myths of Greece and Rome. I also appreciated how the book helped me understand the structural and thematic differences between Egyptian myths and those of other traditions, especially Greece and Rome, particularly their focus on balance, order, and eternal recurrence rather than dramatic tension or tragedy. This volume helped me recognize how Egyptian mythology permeated every aspect of life and death and identity in ancient Egypt, and it certainly left me wanting to explore the stories more. So who is this book for? Well, this book is for anyone who wants to go beyond the surface level familiarity with pyramids and pharaohs and dig into the rich symbolic world that animated ancient Egyptian belief. I think I say that frequently. Despite the title and the size of these books, I think there's an impression that these are books for beginners, and that's certainly not the case. You are diving pretty deep. Even in a short volume, I think there's an expectation that you have a pretty thorough knowledge, or at least a baseline knowledge of pretty much anything that you jump into in this series. If you're a mythology buff looking to explore something outside the Greco-Roman canon, this is an excellent entry point. It also is ideal for students or lifelong learners interested in comparative religion or ancient storytelling or the cultural functions of myth. Egyptology enthusiasts who want to understand the why behind Egyptian rituals and images, like why the sun god travels by boat, why Osiris must be dismembered and reassembled, why the desert plays such an important mythic role, will find this a concise yet an illuminating guide. Also, I wasn't kidding. I do think that fans of Rick Riordan's Kane Chronicles might also enjoy it as a non-fiction counterpart to the mythological world that inspired those books. Finally, anyone working through the very short introduction series, especially those interested in ancient history or religion or symbolic systems, will find this volume both accessible and thought-provoking. So who is this not for? Well, this book isn't for readers expecting thrilling mythological narratives with clear heroes and villains, or those looking for a storybook-style retelling of Egyptian myths. While it does certainly include mythic content, it is structured more as a cultural and thematic analysis than as a compilation of entertaining tales. You won't find, flashy dramatizations of neatly packaged myths the way you might in a volume on Greek or Norse mythology. It's also not the right fit for someone casually curious about ancient Egypt who prefers a more visual or introductory overview. Like many of the very short introductions, it assumes a thoughtful and engaged reader and occasionally moves quickly through complex ideas. If you're completely new to Egyptian history or mythology, you may find it a bit dense or disorienting. I would certainly recommend finding maybe a textbook and certainly something with probably more pictures. One of the wonderful things about Egypt is how many artifacts we have. And I do think it can be a bit of a challenge to really appreciate that in a book like this. This book is a compact but rich exploration of how mythology helped shape and was shaped by one of the longest lasting civilizations in human history. Rather than retelling stories for entertainment, the author Geraldine Pinch invites readers to consider what these myths meant to ancient Egyptians and how they evolved alongside the political, religious, and social changes of the culture. I appreciated how the book shed light on the uniquely Egyptian approach to divine conflict and balance and things like kingship. It's a thoughtful, scholarly take that helped me to see familiar gods and images in a completely new way. I would love to hear your thoughts on this book or any of the author's other works if you've read any of them, or maybe if you've read something like Ancient Egypt, a very short introduction by Ian Shaw, or some other mythology-focused volumes in this series. Please let me know your thoughts in the comments. Again, if you're enjoying this video, Be sure to check out my very short introduction playlist for more. Of course, also check out my other channel, History Unraveled with Dr. Duncan. And like I've said before, I have another similar playlist that might appeal to you about great courses that I have been reviewing, because I've also been using those while writing my scripts. But if you're not interested in any more nonfiction or stuff that I use for writing scripts, check out other videos from my channel. I cover everything, hence the name of the channel, Spencer Reads Everything. And if you're enjoying this video or any of my videos, please share them. The more people that know about my channel, the more videos I can make. And don't forget to like, subscribe, turn on those notifications, and until next time, keep those pages turning.